I was 32 when my world cracked open, sitting in a Savannah law office that smelled of polished oak and old money. I'm Isadora Quinn, a botanist who'd spent a decade coaxing life from stubborn soil, yet there I was, watching my parents' legacy slip through my fingers like sand. The lawyer's voice was a drone, but the words hit like a blade. My sister, Natalie, would inherit $15 million, the sum of my parents' estate, their final gift to her gilded life. My mother's eyes gleamed with pride. My father's nod was curt, approving. Then they turned to me, their faces hardening, and said, "Isadora, make your own way." The room didn't spin. My heart didn't break. It just stopped, as if time itself had paused to let the betrayal sell. I stared at the table, its grain a map of knots and hurls, willing my breath to stay even. Natalie's manicured hand clutched her check, her smile a practiced curve. I wanted to scream, to upend the table, but I sat still, a statue carved from years of silence. Then a rustle broke the quiet. An older man, his suit as gray as November, stood and produced a letter, its edges worn, sealed with my grandfather's unmistakable script. My mother's lips parted, a flicker of unease crossing her face. My father's fingers froze mid-tap. Natalie's gaze sharpened, predatory. That letter wasn't just paper. It was a fuse, lit and hissing toward truths I hadn't dared imagine. It pointed me back to a place I'd avoided for too long, my grandfather's farmhouse on the outskirts of Savannah, where the air once smelled of jasmine and now carried the weight of something unspoken. I hadn't returned since Grandpa's death 2 years prior, when grief had tethered me to my lab instead of his land. The farmhouse, with its sagging porch and ivy-choked fence, had been my childhood haven, where I'd learned to graft roses under his patient hands. Now it loomed in my mind, a monument to questions I wasn't sure I could face. But that letter changed everything. It was a key to a door I didn't know existed, a promise of answers, or maybe vengeance. I couldn't look away. Not when the ground beneath me was already crumbling. Stick with me to see how this letter unraveled a family built on lies and led me to a truth I never expected. And if you're moved by stories of redemption and reckoning, hit that subscribe button to catch the latest from my channel. The farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt road, its clapboard siding weathered to a soft gray, like bones bleached by time. I parked my rental car under a live oak, its branches heavy with Spanish moss, and stepped out, the gravel biting through my thin soles. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and honeysuckle, a perfume that once meant safety, but now felt like a stranger's memory. Wind chimes hung from the porch, their notes flat and mournful, no longer the bright jangle of my childhood summers. I hesitated at the door, its green paint peeling in curls, as if the house itself were shedding its past. Inside, my grandmother, Evelyn, waited, her silhouette sharp against the kitchen's yellow light. Her arms were crossed, her jaw a granite line, and her eyes held no warmth, only a cold appraisal that pinned me in place. She didn't invite me in, she simply turned, leaving the door ajar, and I followed, my boots loud against the worn pine floor. The kitchen smelled of coffee and faintly of mildew, the same as always, but the air was heavier, charged with something unspoken. Evelyn slid a printed email across the table, its edges creased from handling. The words swam before me, messages I'd supposedly sent, claiming I was too busy, too distant, too ashamed to visit during Grandpa's final months. My stomach twisted. I had sent no such emails. My account had been mine since graduate school, its password unchanged.
The truth hit like a stone. Natalie had slipped into my digital life, forging my voice to sever me from this place. Evelyn's gaze softened, but only slightly, as she watched me grapple with the betrayal. The lie wasn't just a miscommunication. It was a calculated theft, one that had kept me from Grandpa's bedside, from his final words. Evelyn sank into a chair, her hands trembling, not from age, but from the weight of her own misjudgment. She'd believed Natalie's story, had let it fester unchallenged. I leaned against the counter, the cool edge grounding me as my mind raced. The farmhouse, once a refuge, now felt like a crime scene, its walls witness to a deception I hadn't seen coming. Evelyn's voice, when it came, was low, deliberate, promising action. She reached for the phone, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her frame. The call she made was brief, her tone clipped, summoning Natalie, my parents, and a lawyer to the farmhouse. Each word she spoke was a step towards unraveling the knot Natalie had tied. I sat at the table, tracing the scars in its wood, marks from years of meals and laughter, now overshadowed by this new jagged truth. Outside, the wind stirred the oaks, their leaves whispering secrets I was only beginning to understand. The farmhouse was no longer just a memory. It was a battlefield, and I was ready to fight for what was mine. The kitchen table bore the weight of our silence, its surface etched with decades of scratches, each one a quiet testament to moments now out of reach. Evelyn sat across from me, her hands folded tightly, as if holding herself together against the storm we'd uncovered. The email had been a spark, but what followed was a blaze. Evelyn's voice, steady but laced with regret, unraveled the deeper lie. Natalie had orchestrated a false narrative, claiming I'd skipped Grandpa's funeral out of indifference. In truth, she'd sent me a forged invitation, listing a time 2 hours late, ensuring I'd arrive to an empty church, my grief met only by locked doors. The betrayal burned hotter now, not just for the act, but for its precision.
Natalie hadn't just lied. She'd weaponized my absence, whispering to relatives and neighbors that I'd turned my back on family. I saw it clearly, her calculated charm, her ability to twist truth into a noose. My fingers curled into fists, nails biting my palms as I fought to keep my anger from spilling over. Evelyn's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw not judgment, but shared pain. She reached into a drawer, pulling out a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact. Grandpa's handwriting filled the margins, not his usual neat script, but a hurried scrawl, as if time had been his enemy. The journal held a coded message, a series of botanical terms, Latin names for plants that only I would recognize as a map. The code pointed to a hidden greenhouse, a place Grandpa had built in secret, tucked behind the farmhouse's pecan grove. It wasn't just a gift, it was a challenge, a puzzle meant to draw me back to the land and the truths he'd left behind. My chest tightened, not with grief, but with a flicker of purpose, a sense that Grandpa had seen this moment coming. Evelyn stood, her movements deliberate, and declared we'd confront the family at dawn. She dialed the lawyer, her voice cold as she demanded his presence, then called Natalie and my parents, her words sharp, brooking no refusal. The phone clicked shut, and the room fell still. The only sound, the hum of the old refrigerator, a reminder of the life that once thrived here. I traced the journal's cover, its leather cool under my fingertips, and felt the weight of Grandpa's trust. The coded message wasn't just a clue, it was a lifeline, pulling me toward a truth my family had buried. Outside, the sky darkened, heavy with the promise of rain, mirroring the storm gathering within me. The farmhouse felt alive now, its walls no longer silent, but pulsing with the secrets we were about to unearth. I sat straighter, my resolve hardening, ready to face the family who tried to erase me. The farmhouse living room was a theater of shadows, its faded curtains drawn against the dawn's pale light. I stood in the kitchen doorway, my pulse a steady drum, as Natalie, my parents, and the lawyer filed in, their footsteps muffled by the worn rug. Natalie's heels clicked with purpose, her navy blazer crisp, but her eyes darted nervously, betraying the confidence she'd always worn like armor. My mother, Patricia, smoothed her skirt, her smile overly bright, as if she could charm away the tension. My father, Leonard, carried himself with the calm of a man used to control, his gaze flickering to the lawyer's briefcase. None of them saw me yet, and I savored the moment, a predator in their unsuspecting midst. Evelyn gestured them to the sofa, her movements sharp, unyielding. The lawyer, Mr. Grayson, adjusted his glasses and opened his briefcase with a snap that cut through the room's murmur. He began with formalities, his voice a low hum, but the air shifted when he produced Grandpa's will, its pages thick with intent. The will was a blade, clean and precise. To Evelyn, Grandpa left the farmhouse and enough funds to live without worry. Then came the strike. To me, Isadora Quinn, he bequeathed a hidden greenhouse at the edge of the pecan grove, complete with rare plant patents and research grants. The estate's remainder, stocks, savings, land, would split evenly between Natalie and me. Natalie's face drained of color, her hands gripping the sofa's armrest. She stood, her voice a hiss, accusing our parents of promising her everything if she played the dutiful daughter. Patricia's eyes dropped to her lap, Leonard's jaw tightened, but neither spoke. The room crackled with their silence, a confession of complicity. Mr. Grayson raised his hand, unmoved, and revealed more. The greenhouse held patents for drought-resistant flora, potentially worth millions, a legacy Natalie hadn't anticipated. She spun toward me, her gaze venomous, threatening legal battles, claiming I'd manipulated Grandpa's frail mind. I met her stare, my spine rigid, refusing to flinch under her fury. Evelyn's voice cut through, cold and final, reminding Natalie that Grandpa's mind had been sharper than hers. The lawyer folded the will, his task complete, and the room seemed to exhale, the truth now a weight we all carried. I sat in the armchair Evelyn had pointed to, my hands steady, feeling the greenhouse's promise like a pulse beneath my skin. Outside, the pecan trees swayed, their leaves catching the first light, as if nodding to the shift within these walls. The family I'd once craved was unraveling, and I was ready to claim what was mine. The living room held its breath, the air thick with the aftershock of the will's revelations. Mr. Grayson reached into his briefcase again, producing a single sheet of paper, its edges softened by time, covered in Grandpa's bold, slanting script. He began reading, his voice steady, each word a stone dropped into the silence. The letter was addressed to me, Isadora, a testament to a bond my family had tried to erase. Grandpa wrote of my childhood, how I'd spent hours in his garden, grafting roses with clumsy hands, my questions about plant resilience, endless, unquenched. He saw my quiet intensity, my need to understand life's roots when others saw only a girl too serious for her age. My mother shifted, her fingers twisting the hem of her blouse. Natalie's arms were crossed, her face a mask of indifference, but her foot tapped a restless rhythm. Leonard stared at the floor as if the rug could hide his shame. Grandpa's words pressed on, recounting how my parents dismissed my botany projects, urging me to be more like Natalie, whose charm they could parade at galas. He wrote of a day I'd nearly forgotten,
My first county fair, aged 12, when my study on soil microbes won a ribbon.
I'd hidden it in my backpack, afraid my mother's sigh or Natalie's smirk would dim its shine. Grandpa had found it, hung it on his workshop wall, and told me my mind was a garden no one could uproot. My throat tightened, a tear slipping free, but I let it fall, unashamed. The letter turned sharper, a blade aimed at my family. Grandpa regretted not shielding me from their neglect, not challenging their preference for Natalie's polished ease. He saw how they dimmed my light, not because I lacked, but because I shone in ways they couldn't control. Natalie's foot stopped tapping, her mask slipping, revealing a flicker of guilt, or perhaps envy. Grandpa's final words were a charge. The greenhouse was my space to grow without apology, to build a legacy from the seeds we'd planted together. Mr. Grayson folded the letter, the sound loud in the stillness, and handed it to Evelyn, who pressed it to her chest. I sat taller, the weight of Grandpa's belief anchoring me, a counterforce to years of being unseen. The room felt smaller now, not confining, but intimate, as if Grandpa's voice had reclaimed it. Outside, the morning light filtered through the pecan grove, casting dappled shadows that danced like the possibilities now within my reach. The living room was a battlefield, its air charged with the residue of Grandpa's letter. I stood, my legs steadied despite the pulse hammering in my chest, and faced Natalie, her eyes glinting with defiance that no longer intimidated me. Her lies had been laid bare, not just the forged emails, but a broader campaign, whispers to Savannah's donors that I'd abandoned my family for a selfish career. She'd painted me as cold, ungrateful, ensuring my name carried a stain in the circles where Grandpa's legacy still held sway. The truth, sharp as a thorn, fueled my voice as I spoke, not to plead, but to accuse. Natalie's face twisted, her usual poise unraveling. She leaned forward, her hands clenched, as if she could will the room back under her control. My parents sat frozen, Patricia's eyes darting to Leonard, seeking an anchor, but he offered none, his silence a confession of complicity. I recounted the years of their neglect, how they'd celebrated Natalie's every step, while my achievements were met with sighs or indifference. Evelyn rose, her presence a quiet storm, and her voice, when it came, was steel. She spoke not to Natalie, but through her, addressing the family's collective failure. She trusted their lies, believed I'd chosen distance, and now bore the shame of her own blindness. Her words were a verdict, naming their manipulation for what it was, not love, but a transaction they'd all endorsed. She pointed to the door, her arm unwavering, and ordered them out. Natalie's breath caught, her defiance crumbling into something raw, almost desperate. She grabbed her purse, her heels striking the floor like sparks, and stormed into the dawn. Patricia followed, her steps hesitant, murmuring about lawyers and appeals, while Leonard trailed behind, his shoulders slumped, a man diminished by his own choices. The door closed with a soft click, not a slam, but the sound carried a finality that settled into the room's bones. I stood still, my breath shallow, as the weight of their absence replaced the tension of their presence. Evelyn sank onto the sofa, her hands steady now, her eyes holding a fire that hadn't dimmed. Outside, the pecan grove stood sentinel, its leaves whispering in the morning breeze, as if the land itself approved of the purge. The farmhouse felt lighter, its walls no longer burdened by pretense, ready to hold the truth we'd reclaimed. The farmhouse kitchen was quiet now, the dawn's light spilling through the window, painting the table in soft golds. I sat alone, my fingers tracing the wood's familiar scars, each mark a memory of meals shared with Grandpa, of his laughter as I described my latest plant experiment. The confrontation had left me hollow, not with anger, but with the realization of how long I'd chased a love that didn't exist. My parents, Natalie, they'd built a family on conditions, offering affection only when I fit their mold, a mold I'd never match. I'd spent years proving myself, grafting my identity onto their expectations, only to find their approval was a mirage, always out of reach. The farmhouse, once a place of pain, began to shift in my mind. Its creaking floors, its ivy-draped porch, its scent of earth and time, they were no longer reminders of exclusion, but anchors to a truth Grandpa had always seen. He'd taught me to graft roses, to coax life from fragile stems, and in doing so, he'd shown me my own resilience. I thought of a summer, aged 10, when he'd helped me save a wilting jasmine, his hands steady as he explained how even broken things could bloom again. Evelyn moved through the kitchen, her steps slow but deliberate, setting a kettle on the stove. Her presence was a quiet promise, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this reclamation. We didn't speak of the family's departure, but her glance, warm and steady, told me she understood the weight of what we'd done. The farmhouse was ours now, a space to rebuild without their shadows. I stepped outside, the porch boards groaning under my weight, and walked to the pecan grove where the hidden greenhouse waited. I hadn't seen it yet, but Grandpa's journal described it, a glass sanctuary filled with rare plants, a legacy he'd built for me. As I stood among the trees, their branches heavy with unripe nuts, I found a single flower, a wild orchid, its petals delicate against the rough bark. It felt like a sign, a whisper of the discoveries to come. Back inside, the kettle's whistle called me to the table where Evelyn waited, her hands wrapped around a mug.
The farmhouse felt alive, its walls humming with possibility, and I knew I was ready to begin again, not as the girl they'd overlooked, but as the woman Grandpa had always believed in. The greenhouse stood at the edge of the pecan grove, its glass panels catching the morning sun like a prism, scattering light across the red Georgia clay. I pushed open its heavy doors, the hinges creaking, and stepped into a world Grandpa had crafted for me, a sanctuary of green and possibility. The space was alive with the hum of life, rows of rare orchids, their petals like delicate secrets, trays of drought-resistant grasses, their roots curling through experimental soil, and shelves lined with equipment, spectrometers, soil sensors, a digital microscope still in its box. In the center, a workbench held a small wooden box, its lid carved with my initials. Inside, a collection of seeds, each labeled in Grandpa's hand, a gift from my childhood when I'd begged for magic plants to grow. My knees softened, and I gripped the bench, steadying myself against the weight of his faith. I threw myself into the greenhouse, recruiting 2 former classmates, Lena and Marcus, whose passion for conservation matched my own. We started small, testing Grandpa's patented seeds in local fields, battling pests and unpredictable rains. Rejections came, grants denied, proposals returned with curt notes, but we persisted, driven by a stubborn belief that these plants could change lives. A corporate offer arrived, a sleek letter from a biotech firm offering millions to buy the greenhouse and its patents. The sum was dizzying, a temptation to trade Grandpa's vision for security. I sat in the greenhouse at dusk, the glass walls glowing with the day's last light, and weighed the choice. The seeds on the workbench seemed to watch me, their potential a quiet rebuke to the easy path. I tore the letter in half, the sound sharp in the stillness, and felt a clarity settle over me. We pushed forward, securing a grant for a community garden, teaching local farmers to use our grasses to combat drought. Mistakes piled up, overwatered trays, miscalibrated sensors, but each failure taught us something new. I thought of Grandpa, how he'd called my childhood experiments noble tries, never failures. His belief was the greenhouse's foundation, stronger than its glass. One evening, alone among the orchids, I found a journal entry Grandpa had tucked into a seed catalog, describing a hybrid he'd dreamed of, one I was now close to creating. My chest ached with gratitude, not just for the greenhouse, for the man who'd seen my future when I couldn't. The work was hard, but it was mine, and that was enough to keep me going. The greenhouse was quiet, its glass walls fogged with morning dew, when Natalie's car pulled up the dirt road, its tires crunching softly against the clay.
I stood at the workbench, sorting seed packets, and watched her approach, her navy coat loose on her frame, her hair unstyled, a far cry from the polished sister I'd known. She paused at the door, her hand hovering as if asking permission to enter a space she'd once tried to erase. I nodded, and she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the rows of plants, the community garden plans pinned to the wall, the photos of children holding their first seedlings. Her presence was a jolt, not unwelcome but unfamiliar, like a song I'd forgotten the words to. I gave her a tour, my voice steady as I explained the drought-resistant grasses, the orchid conservation project, the youth program teaching kids to love the earth. Natalie listened, her questions simple but earnest. How we funded the work, how the kids shared their findings, what the plants could do for struggling farmers. Her hands, once quick to gesture or dismiss, stayed quiet, tucked into her pockets, as if she feared breaking something fragile. At the community garden, where families tended plots using our methods, she stopped, watching a boy and his mother laugh as they pulled carrots from the soil. Her face softened, and she spoke, her voice low, admitting she'd lost her $15 million to reckless investments, her confidence undone by her own choices. The admission hung between us, not an apology, but a crack in her armor, a glimpse of the sister she might have been. I didn't push her, didn't demand explanations. I let her stay, wandering the greenhouse, her fingers brushing the leaves of a young orchid. Weeks later, she returned, offering a fundraising guide for our youth program, its pages meticulous, designed to draw donors without overshadowing the kids' work. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, a gesture that felt like a bridge, however shaky. Natalie began volunteering twice a year, helping students pitch their projects to local councils, her charm now a tool for their success. The kids called her Miss Nat, their trust a quiet rebuke to the sister who'd once cut me out. We didn't speak of forgiveness, but her presence, steady and unassuming, was a kind of amends, enough for now. Outside, the pecan grove stood watch, its branches swaying in the evening breeze, as if the land itself bore witness to this fragile new beginning. The greenhouse hummed with life, and I felt, for the first time, that Natalie and I might find a way to coexist within it. The greenhouse had grown beyond its glass walls, its influence stretching across continents, a quiet revolution rooted in the red clay of Savannah. I stood at the edge of our trial fields, now spanning 80 acres, where drought-resistant grasses swayed under a late summer sky, their blades catching the light like a promise kept. 7 years had passed since the will reading, since Natalie's heel struck the farmhouse porch like a final chord. since my parents' shadows faded into a life I no longer tracked.
Their names surfaced occasionally, charity gala mentions, a Florida real estate column, but they were ghosts now, irrelevant to the world I'd built. I didn't hate them, I simply didn't need them, a truth that felt like freedom. The greenhouse was no longer a single structure, but a campus, 3 glass houses and 2 labs, their roofs glinting under the Georgia sun. We'd patented a hybrid clover, its roots binding soil against erosion, now planted in arid regions from Senegal to New Mexico. Universities in Brazil and Kenya shared our data, their researchers calling our work a blueprint for survival in a warming world. Last spring, I'd stood on a stage in Seattle, accepting a Global Conservation Award. Grandpa's grafting knife tucked in my pocket, its worn handle a talisman against the spotlight's glare. The knife rested on my desk now, beside a photo of me at 10, clutching a potted fern at a school science fair. Grandpa's grin wide behind me. Evelyn had given it to me on my 35th birthday, her hands trembling as she pressed it into mine, saying he'd carried it daily, a reminder of the girl who'd never stopped asking why. Some mornings, I held it, tracing its initials, and spoke to him in the quiet. Not prayers, but thanks for the map he'd left me. The youth program, our Little Growers initiative, was my proudest work. It began with 15 students, kids from rural schools where science meant dusty textbooks and borrowed dreams. We gave them seed kits, journals, modeled after my own, their first pages stamped with Grandpa's words, "Write the things they don't understand. One day the world will." I remembered a boy, Javier, 14, his notes on clover pollination so precise I'd wept reading them. When I told him he could publish, his eyes widened as if I'd handed him the stars. Last month, Javier's study won a national grant, and he wrote me a letter, his handwriting shaky but sure, thanking me for seeing him. I framed it, hung it beside Grandpa's portrait in the greenhouse lobby, where visitors, farmers, scientists, donors, paused to read our story. The program had grown to 200 students, their experiments feeding data into our global network, their voices proof that curiosity could thrive in overlooked places. Evelyn lived in a cottage beside my home now, its windows open to the jasmine she'd planted decades ago. She moved slower, her memory softer at the edges, but her wit cut like a blade when it mattered. We drank coffee each dawn, her stories of Grandpa unfolding like petals, how he'd once grafted a peach tree to propose, how he'd believed plants held memories of care. She said he'd known I'd return, not to the farmhouse, but to myself, a prediction that felt truer with each passing year. The corporate offer came again last winter, a biotech giant doubling their bid for the greenhouse and its patents. Their letter was polished, promising wealth and scale, but it misunderstood what we'd built. I stood in the glass house that night, surrounded by orchids whose ancestors I'd saved as a girl, and saw Grandpa's hand in every leaf. The offer wasn't a temptation, it was an insult to the legacy we'd sown. I burned the letter in the garden fire pit, the flames curling its edges as Lena and Marcus watched, their nods silent agreement. We'd faced worse than corporate greed. A failed irrigation trial cost us a season's data. A storm shattered half our second glass house. Each setback stung, but we rebuilt, learning from the land as Grandpa had taught me. I thought of a day, age 12, when a hailstorm destroyed my first herb bed. He'd knelt beside me, his hands in the mud, and said disasters were just questions waiting for answers. That lesson lived in every repair, every new seed we planted. One evening, I walked to the trial field's far end, where a wooden bench Grandpa had built stood under a live oak. The kids' garden plots bloomed nearby, their marigolds and beans, a ride of color against the clay. I sat, the bench's slats warm from the day, and looked up at the stars, brighter here than in the city, their patterns as familiar as the constellations I'd once mapped with him. I thought of the girl I'd been, dirt under her nails, eyes wide with questions, and realized she wasn't gone. She was the root of everything I'd become. Natalie's visits had settled into a rhythm, her volunteering a quiet constant. She never spoke of our past, but her work with the kids, teaching them to pitch ideas with confidence, felt like a language we could both understand. Last summer, she'd brought a donor to the campus, her introduction so seamless we'd secured funding for a new lab. I didn't call her sister in the way others might, but the word no longer carried a sting. The wind moved through the oak, its leaves rustling like a conversation I could almost hear. I closed my eyes, imagining Grandpa's voice, steady and sure, urging me to keep writing the things they didn't understand. The world was listening now. Farmers planting our seeds, students publishing their findings, a planet slowly healing. His legacy wasn't the greenhouse or the patents. It was the permission he'd given me to grow without fear, to build a life that answered to no one but myself. I stood, brushing oak leaves from my jeans, and walked back to the greenhouse, its lights glowing against the dusk. The work waited, always, but it was work I loved, work that mattered. And that, more than any inheritance, was the gift Grandpa had left me, a map to a life I'd earned, one seed at a time. If this story of resilience and roots moved you, hit that like button and share with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to my channel for more tales of triumph, and join me as we uncover the next chapter of this journey.